Great. So I think we'll get underway with just a brief beginning introduction. Tonight we'll be doing it's a conversation and a video with Kathleen Saltzwedel, and we'll be getting underway shortly. I noticed that some of the people that registered this evening are not members of the Alcuin Society or are new registrants. So I'll take just a moment really quickly to discuss the Alcuin Society, and then we'll go into this evening. So the Alcuin Society was founded in 1965. It's the only nonprofit organization in Canada that's dedicated to the entire range of interests related to the books. So through Amphora, the Society's journal mostly, which is published 3 times per year, we cover topics including authorship, publishing, book design, book production, book history, calligraphy, really you name it. We sort of deal with most articles. And we are indeed always looking for content as well. So if anyone has any suggestions or interests that they'd like to explore through Amphora, please get in touch with our editor, Peter Mitham. His contact information is on our website, so please get in touch that way. To further our aims, we also engage in a variety of different programs and lectures, such as the one that you're attending this evening, as well through the Alcuin Society's annual awards for excellence in book design. And now that happens annually, and the winners of this award represent the nation at the international exhibitions and competition in both Frankfurt and Leipzig, and that happens also annually. As well, the Society offers the Robert R. Reed Award and Medal to recognize lifetime achievement and as well as extraordinary contributions to the book arts in Canada. So if you're not a member and you're considering, please get in touch with us if you have any further questions, or go to our site. I'll put a link in the chat this evening if you're interested in going further. Now, this evening, if you have any questions, please just put them in the chat and we'll be able to get to them later on. What we'll do for the format is we'll present Caroline's a video presentation that she put together, and then afterwards we'll open up to questions from the audience, and really very much looking forward to this this somewhat kind of a late night, early morning session for the Alcuin Society. Now again, a great deal of thanks goes out to Gina Page, the program director for the Alcuin Society, who organized this talk, as well as all the other ones that you've been able to enjoy and access through the YouTube channel. And indeed, this one will also be uploaded later as well. Now, on to this evening's the presentation put together by Caroline, but as well herself. Kathleen Saltzwedel was born in England, however, lives in Hamburg. She studied German and French literature at Durham, Oxford, and Bonn University, and printmaking at the Ruskin School of Art. She completed a D.Phil at Oxford on the poetry and translations of Paul Celan in 1988, and was a member of the Oxford Printmakers Cooperative from 1988 to 1995. She has been making artists' books for over 20 years, and in 1998 founded the Hirundo Press as an imprint. The first book from the press was Impossibility, a collaboration with Robert Crawford. Other writers with whom she has worked include Kathleen Jamie, Robert Bringhurst, and German novelist and essayist Martin Mosebach. She has had numerous solo exhibitions and participates regularly in the book art fairs in Europe, as well as CODEX in North America. So to begin this evening, we will, as I mentioned, we'll go view a video that she's put together connected with her theme for the evening for this talk. And then again, please, if you have any questions, put them in the chat, and we will address them later on about her process and her approach. So with that, I will bring up the video, and it's about a 35-minute video. So sit back and enjoy, and then we will discuss afterward.
Hello, I'm Caroline. I make artists' books. I've been doing that for over 20 years now. The Alcuin Society has asked me to tell you a bit about them and why I make them, what they are, and what sort of techniques I use. And what I want to show you now is a sort of slideshow with a few video inserts. What is an artist's book? It's perhaps best defined as the book as a work of art. It shouldn't be confused with an art book or a book about art. It's an original, hand-printed, hand-bound work, usually in a small edition. Sometimes the paper is also handmade. The French term is livre d'artiste. Many galleries refuse to exhibit them as they can't be hung on walls. Show them in a glass case and you can't turn the pages. The best way to exhibit them is open on a table, but that's the most risky. Yet you want to be able to feel the paper and smell the inks. How did I begin? My education was on the academic side. I was early fascinated by languages, literature, and poetic speech. At the same time, I was prone to draw whatever entered my field of vision, and at one point seriously considered going to art college instead of university. But it was my further study on the poetry of Paul Celan which brought me into direct contact with artists' books. Paul Celan's wife, Gisèle Celan-Lestrange, was an etcher who created suites of images to accompany his dense, dark poetry. In Marbach, sitting in a corner of the German Literary Archive, I studied one cycle of her work after another and was utterly fascinated by the medium. I learnt how to etch my first plate when I was supposed to be concentrating on Celan in Bonn. Back in Oxford, I studied printmaking for 2 years with Jean Lodge, then head of printmaking at the Ruskin School of Fine Art. I moved to Hamburg in 1995 and shortly afterwards bought an etching press, which still stands in the middle of my small workshop. At about the same time, 1997, a wonderful new museum opened to the public in Hamburg, the Museum of Work, which contained a fully equipped printing shop and a typesetting room. I joined as a member in 1998 and began learning typography with a maverick old East Prussian typesetter whose canny humour and practical skill were both legendary. As they say, I've never looked back. I've been active in the museum ever since, and have been working as a volunteer there for about 20 years now. 1998 was when I made my first artist's book, so I needed a name for my press. What I didn't foresee was the question asked by around 70% of people, is that Japanese? This is despite the logo next to the name. Well, no, and I'm relieved to say it doesn't mean anything in Japanese either, except the do at the end, which actually means company, so that's all right. The Hirundo rustica, the barn swallow, is one of my favourite birds, and a remarkable bird of passage. Making an artist's book can't be forced. It's an organic process, especially when collaborating with an author. From the start, I wanted to work with living poets and print hitherto unpublished texts, along with new prints. This needs patience, tenacity, sometimes chutzpah, often good fortune. I think it's best described in terms of dialogue. Words taking visible and tangible form. This fusion of the senses, or synesthesia, is an experience shared by anyone who comes in contact with this art form. Each pigment has a different aroma. Each paper has a different sound and feel. Shakespeare's rustic character Bottom, the weaver, delightfully confuses the senses and unconsciously puts his finger on a truth of aesthetic perception. I see a voice, now will I to the chink, to spy and I can hear my Thisbe's face. When I make an artist's book, I think there are three kinds of dialogue that take place. I'll attempt to describe them as briefly as possible. Firstly, and ideally, there's the literal dialogue with the poets themselves, if they're contemporary, and with the works involved. This often involves a dialogue with and about materials and techniques. Which medium, which technique is the most appropriate? What does the material I use tell me? The dialogue with a living author is the literal conversation. For some works, this is an essential element. Robert Crawford was the first poet I worked with. I'd got to know him and his poetry at college. In 1998, we came together to produce Impossibility, a poem 360 lines long about the Scottish writer Margaret Oliphant. When preparing the presentation of this book, he described my images not as illustrations, but as rhyming pictures, in other words, a kind of visual dialogue. This rang true with me, and I've used the term many times since. We collaborated again almost 20 years later to make Fire, which we first presented in early 2017. Dialogue with the poet was just as essential here. When Robert Crawford sent me the poems, the explosive power of the minimalistic lines made me think of another work that I made some years before, Elements. Immediately a dialogue with the poems began. I wanted to allude to the origins of Zoroastrian fire incantations and the fire fragments of Heraclitus, which are quoted in these poems. The language of the Zoroastrians, Avesta, was only written down about 400 years after the language had died out. So, in the first stage of etching, I used the imprint of papyrus in the etching ground and scratched over this ground in this reconstructed Avesta. It looks like a kind of Proto-Syriac. That way I thought to indicate both temporal distance and yet continuing presence of the texts. The format is large, 33 centimeters high, 54 centimeters wide, and the 6 etchings hang together in concertina form to make a frieze. I added 3 Heraclitus quotations, fragments on the nature of fire, along the base of the images to underline this frieze idea. I thought it would interest Robert to see this stage of the work, but was a bit taken aback by his response. I hope you're going to still talk to me after this email. His objection was, where's the fire? And he didn't want to look like a poeta doctus. My dialogue with the work had run ahead of my dialogue with the author. I made haste to reassure him that the etching process was still unfinished and that the fire was still to come. When I set about the next stage, or in etching parlance, the next state of the etching, it was clear to me that a technique I'd more or less invented would here come into its own. This involves marbling the plate with stop-out varnish and then etching it. I've used this in many different situations. Here, it made the plates suddenly very fiery indeed. It succeeded, in fact, in doing what Heraclitus describes in the first fragment that appears here. Krene kai katalepsetai. In the end, the fire will come to judge and destroy all things. It practically effaces much of the cited text, both the Avesta and the Greek. Moreover, the odd structures in 3 of the etchings now appear as wood in cross-section, crackling and burning. The principle of rhyming pictures also holds for my books when the author can no longer intervene, as with James Joyce. Here too, a dialogue ensues. The first Joyce-inspired book I made was to celebrate the 100th anniversary of Bloomsday on the 16th of June 2004. Ein Hamburger Ulysses became not just a dialogue between me and Joyce, but a three-way dialogue across time and space. Joyce's Ulysses, Leopold Bloom, is modelled on Homer's Odysseus, and I take him a century forward and transport him to Hamburg. Each page of the cycle is divided into a main image and a sub-image. When I was making these etchings, people were starting to telephone with mobile phones and live their private lives in public. Very odd at the time. They began to appear in these images. But each of the 18 etches in Ulysses in Hamburg has a visual footnote referring to the Odyssey. You could call this a dialogue between the works, moderated by me. The idea of letting works correspond with one another is of course not mine, but occasionally a parallel suggests itself with such force that I cannot help responding. This happened in the case of Wagner's Meistersinger von Nuremberg. I've long been fascinated by this masterpiece. I could spend the rest of my talk explaining why. But I struggled to find the right means of expression. I even rejected an early attempt at approaching the subject. Then it occurred to me there were parallels throughout with Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream. At that point, all sorts of things fell into place. I'll give one example. In Act 1 of the Meistersinger, the craftsmen gather together to prepare for the celebrations of St. John's Day the next day, 24th of June. One of the masters calls the names, the craftsman in question raises his hand in response, sits down, quorum is complete, the meeting can begin. In A Midsummer Night's Dream, the rustic craftsmen get together, the names are called, and the roles are distributed for the play within the play, which is presented at the end of the play. The Midsummer Night could indeed be the same as the night of the Meistersinger, St. John's Eve. This night is full of waking dreams, which leave the characters confused until the spell is broken. Over the years, I've made books and prints using many different techniques. Collograph, printing from a sort of collage, is one of them. Woodcut's another. I've made 2 books using only woodcut and type. And then there's etching. There are many different ways of etching and printing a copper plate. All take time, which tends to make this the most expensive technique. For those unfamiliar with it, here's a brief description. Etching is called an intaglio technique, meaning incised, a term originally used for engraving. In German, it's called Tiefdruck, deep printing. This means the plate is inked and then wiped, leaving the printable image in all the recesses, lines and grooves. The surface is not printed. This is also why printing and etching involves damping the paper so that the felts press into the plate and create an impression which you can see on the back of the paper afterwards. The opposite is relief printing, in German Hochdruck, which is what I do in the Museum of Work with type. This works to the opposite principle. Here only the surface is printed. I sometimes spend weeks getting a plate to the state I want it to be. Drawing, laying grounds, stopping out, etching, doing a trial proof, then deciding it needs more etching, and so on. Printing the edition is another chapter. The larger the plate, the longer it takes to ink and wipe it. Each of the 6 etchings for the Fire Special Edition took 1.5 hours to ink, wipe and print. Each plate. Because it's so time-consuming, etching's becoming altogether rarer. No artist can afford to charge for all the time spent in this process unless they happen to be world famous. Then they can charge anything. But this means that when you buy an etching, it may seem more expensive than a woodcut or lino cut, but you're getting better value. Perhaps the most exciting technique I learned was Stanley William Hayter's method of printing in 3 colours simultaneously from one etching plate. He called this simultaneous colour printing. It's become more widely known as viscosity printing. Bill Hayter was not keen on the term, but it is quite descriptive. It's a combination of intaglio and relief printing. In other words, starts as a normal etching and then uses 2 rollers to deposit the other 2 colours. When it's done properly, it looks like magic. It takes a while to master this technique, especially if you're aiming for an edition of prints, as I usually do. The patience involved, and in more recent times the tendency for etchers to use water-based inks, has made this technique extremely rare. I don't know any other artist who still practices it. All the more reason to give you a glimpse of how it works. Here I am in my workshop a few days ago. I'm printing from a small plate, 10 by 15 centimetres, which doesn't take so long to ink and wipe. All the same, the process from start to finish, inking, wiping, applying the other inks, printing, laying the print to dry, preparing for the next inking, is never shorter than 20 minutes. The prerequisite for this technique is that the plate must have a few deeply etched areas. That means you can see areas of indentation that are deeper than the rest of the plate. Here's the plate before inking. You can see several small deep recesses near the base of the plate. They lie about 0.2 millimeters below the remaining plate surface, which is about 1 millimeter thick. Here I am wiping the plate. I've speeded up the process a bit. The surface of the plate is now so clean that I can see my face in it. I could print it now, and it would be a totally normal etching, dark blue on the white paper. But now comes the fascinating bit. I want the recesses to be printed in dark red, while keeping the rest of the image relatively pale. So I've mixed 2 other inks, one a pale blue with a lot of transparent white in it, and an intense berry red. How do I deposit these 2 inks where I want them to be? The viscosity tag gives a clue. I mix the pale blue with quite a lot of thin linseed oil to make it fairly fluid. The red I leave naturally stiff. Then I take 2 rollers, one hard and the other soft. I use the hard roller to roll out an area of pale blue, not too thick, but enough so that you can just see the ink on the glass. It looks almost white. The soft roller is used to roll up the red. The difference in ink consistency has the effect that the pale blue resists the red, while the red ink on the soft roller picks up some of the pale blue. But first I need to test that the pale blue is really thin enough to create a resistance to the stiff red ink. I do this by rolling a small amount of the blue on the glass and then the red crosswise over it. You see the red ink doesn't adhere to the blue. I sometimes compare this to spreading a piece of toast first with oil and then with butter. Butter cannot adhere to an oilier surface. Now comes the real test. With the hard roller, I roll a film of the pale blue ink over the entire plate. Being hard rubber, it only makes contact with the surface. The recesses are untouched. Then I repeat the process with the soft roller. This time, I apply a bit of downward pressure when rolling. That way, the soft roller penetrates the area the hard roller doesn't touch. A cross-section of the plate could look like this. And this is the result. There are clear divisions between the different colours. The finished print looks like this. Some people ask me if you can use this method at all for printing an edition. Surely each etching is a matter of chance and so unique. Well, strictly speaking, every hand-inked etching is unique, whether this special technique is used or not. Hand pressure when inking, the strokes of the hand when wiping, the amount of plate tone left make some prints better or more intense than others. This can often be seen in the case of prints by Rembrandt or Dürer that come up for sale. Add to this the hand pressure on the rollers when applying the second and third inks, and the amount of ink on them, and the chance element appears all the greater. But chance should not be a major issue. The distinction between colours is defined by the etching on the plate. That is what comes with experience. A good printer will be able to produce an edition that looks like one, despite minor variations. Here's an example. This etching technique has the advantage of being completely independent of artistic style. The three-dimensional quality of deep etching is a sculptural exploration of the material, but doesn't mean that my images take on the character of other artists who've used it. Experiment is, of course, part of the etching process. This is where surprises can happen. And afterwards there are experiments with colour, which can also surprise. The same plate, printed in different inks, can be used to astonishing effect. But I decide on a particular colour combination before beginning the final edition. I used this technique predominantly in the first few years. Impossibility, The Green Woman, Daedalus, Ulysses were all made with simultaneous colour printing. With Ulysses, the technique was particularly appropriate as it allowed brighter colours in the main images and a more restrained treatment of the small footnotes. Naturally, I don't make all etchings with this technique. The images to accompany Robert Bringhurst's poem, Stopping By, which were printed on a special grey paper by Rive, are more or less in black and white, with only a suggestion of colour. And I don't always use etching. When making Daedalus, a cycle of poems by K.A. Perriman that appeared in 2000, I was also beginning to explore the possibilities of woodcut, as the cover for the normal edition demanded an image that could be printed along with the poems on the cylinder press. This is a reduction print, which means the edition can only be made once. 5 years later, I repeated the idea, using the same format, type and paper, with his poems on waves and water, was Wellen betrifft, or concerning waves. I planned no special edition for this book, but as with Daedalus, I inserted one loose leaf etching into the front cover. It's the image I printed for you just now. The standard edition of Fire also had a woodcut cover, also in reduction print. Here 4 inks are printed on a red ground, becoming ever whiter and hotter. Sometimes woodcut became the medium of choice for the whole book. This was the case with Grotesken von Sabioneta, a poem by Tobias Roth on an ideal Renaissance city of minuscule proportions. which in fact still exists practically in its original form and was added to the list of UNESCO World Heritage in 2008. The sharp edges of woodcut and the fluid grain of the wood give a balance to the spiky images which echo the star fortification of the city. These are the silver thistle, the metaphor used by the poet, the fawn's hair, and even the goddess of liberty who signals the city's motto, Libertas. All these approaches are forms of dialogue, with the appropriate technique and with the materials. They are intrinsic to the first dialogue, which is with the works themselves. But they are equally important in the third dialogue, and that is with the viewer or the reader, in the end with you. How best to convey the idea so that the format, the paper, the technique say something coherent? How thick or transparent should the paper be? Should the colour scheme be bright or a range of more muted shades? The word in German is stimmig, which reminds one of Stimme, voice, but also means everything harmonizes. That's the aim of every artist's book. It was also important when considering another theme, and this time it involved no active collaboration with an author. The Museum of Work is my second home in workshop terms. Here you can see the area where I'm particularly active. Here are the Boston Platen presses, the proofing presses, and the typesetting room. You're looking at the calm before the storm, so to speak. Half an hour later, the area was full of visitors being shown around. In 2018, the traditional printing techniques, letterpress, lithography, etching, were declared immaterial cultural treasures of the UNESCO. You could exchange the word immaterial for living and you'd be nearer the mark, as it's still a living, breathing phenomenon here. This honour prompted me to consider documenting the workshop in the Museum of Work in a special book. I was also concerned to capture the status quo in case anything should change in the next few years. One can never tell. It was to be a cross-section of our printing room, featuring all the machines that are still in regular use, printed on a special translucent paper so that the eye could wander through the space. My first attempts at rendering this idea were in woodcut, and I very soon realised that it wasn't going to work. It wasn't stimmig at all. It wasn't appropriate. What I needed to do was use the workshop's own medium, metal type. So, with a certain amount of trepidation, partly as this meant stepping in the shoes of my brilliant and recently deceased colleague Mike Kruger, who produced large typographic images of extraordinary complexity, I began a framework for the book. Then lockdown happened, and as the project was already underway, I was permitted to work alone in the museum. So that's how I spent the summer months of 2020, standing in the typesetting room and puzzling one piece after another. What began with rapid sketches of the machines became small elements that would eventually be united in a complete overview. You need to be able to calculate accurately when composing such pieces. Each point matters. The piece depicting the large etching press was extremely tricky, as it needed angled pieces of filling material. The Heidelberg windmill was far too wide in my first attempt, and I needed 2 more takes until it was right. The format I originally had in mind was long and flat, mirroring the elevation of the museum's first upper floor, along with the central pillars, and featuring a ground plan behind in roughly the same dimensions. This was where a dialogue or even a discussion began. My friend and colleague Anne, our technician, immediately saw a problem with this idea. How would the book fit on a normal bookshelf? Sometimes you need a totally practical question to throw everything up in the air. With any luck, it will soon settle down again. My solution was to divide the book in the middle, which means that the book more or less begins in the middle, as a text on the back flap also says. But, of course, it's just as possible to leaf through normally. So I reserved the long format for the 10 special copies and printed half of the sheets on the CODEX proofing press. I had 10 cloth-bound cases made for them and decided against a conventional binding for the sheets. Instead, I used book screws, which echo the metal of the machines depicted. The texts for the book were set on the monotype in gill. At the beginning is a text by me about the museum, and at the end is the Bauhaus Manifesto by Walter Gropius. He evokes the symbiosis of art and craft, which is exactly what we practice here in the Museum of Work. The main edition was printed on the Heidelberg cylinder press by my colleagues Walter Fischer and Klaus Rasch. Here they are at work. The motifs in the book were used a second time to a very different effect, this time with brightly mixed colours on variously hued historic paper from the 1970s. The result was a fold-out in the magazine for the Book Art Fair in Hamburg in 2021. My dialogue with the reader, of course, doesn't stop there. At least, I'd like to think that I also provoke questions about the content. This quite often seems to be the case. I like noting the reactions to my work, as they're as varied as the viewers themselves. If I can encourage people to think about the topic in question, so much the better. I aim to continue this dialogue in my next books. They will be of rather different character, using a lot of handmade paper and combining etching and letterpress. What you see here are 2 prototypes. These will, I hope, be completed in the course of this year. I'd like to finish with a couple of images showing the younger generation engaging with metal type. There's a society here promoting Gutenberg's black art, Verein für die schwarze Kunst. Every year it gives a couple of young people a grant to go on a waltz, or journeyman's way. They visit different workshops and learn the nitty-gritty of a craft long declared dead, but in fact still very much alive. These 2 were active in the museum recently. Their enthusiasm, their skill, is essential to hand on the flame. People need to be encouraged in this, but also in the daily enjoyment of books. A printer without a sense of his or her own culture is, I think, an anomaly. It's a challenge we can all take on. The generation now reaching maturity lives to a large extent in a digital world. Many have never held a real book in their hands. They need the opportunity to read old books as well as new ones, or e-books. And so do all of us, or we lose our sense of proportion. Books from former eras are an essential element of the bibliosphere. Let's all rediscover the joy of books with no ISBN and with unreconstructed content. When, if not now?
That was great. Thank you so much. again, if anyone has any questions, please put them through the chat. I have a couple questions just to begin with. The process, the multi-layered etching process that you're describing for many of your projects, sort of the earlier ones, how did you wade into that process? You were mentioning the layers of time, you know, the kind of commitment of different phases. At what point did you start adding in all those phases and starting to engage with the kind of endurance of it? It seems like there's a real feeling of a commitment to it. When did you feel that it was really worth it to pursue that technique?
I think probably from the very beginning, because what I started with was just single plates, single images, which were not connected with books. They were just prints for themselves. So I did some large prints, smaller prints, and discovered the technique that way.
Fantastic. Let's see if there are any questions coming in. Another thing I thought about, you're mentioning, you know, your involvement with poetry. What role does music play in your work? You're talking about harmony and these engagements. There was music. I heard what seemed to be Middle Ages choral or Gregorian music, perhaps in the back when you were mixing the colors.
No, no.
That's something that's present.
It was actually Schubert, but but I often listen to music when I'm working. So yes, so it just happened to be Schubert, a Schubert lead.
Yeah.
But yes, what role does it play? Well, with the Wagner, of course, it's essential. It means that I'm trying to correspond with the form of the music in visual terms. So, which is of course, well, in some ways impossible, but what I was doing with the Wagner was I also had the texts printed on, I printed them on Japanese paper so that you could fold it out and it looked a bit like a musical score. So that was one correspondence, if you like. But
we have a question that came in here. How do you work out the shape of the typographic page? How does it relate to your etching or woodcut image? So the sort of layout and those sorts of factors.
Well, sometimes it's totally classical, and I more or less correspond to the golden section, or I try to. But sometimes it's much more experimental, and I would generally aim to have the type block or the area of type so corresponding to the page that it won't dominate it. So sometimes it's a little bit over the 2/3 or whatever it is, the ideal that Chichod talks about, but generally it's also an experiment. You look at how much paper you've got, how large the format is, and aim to fit the type in there. And sometimes the area of type is a little bit larger, sometimes a bit smaller.
I have a question here, sort of on the same lines of what proportion of text in your work is written by other people how much writing do you do yourself? You know, you're mentioning that most recent project you did where you had some texts. Are there any other works?
Yes, there's in the Joyce. I was making this before Ulysses went out of copyright, so I wasn't allowed to quote anything except very, very small. And so what I did, and of course it was far too large, so what I did was actually comment on each of the chapters. So that was my text, but it was referring to Joyce. And I did a sort of concertina commentary, which went along with 18 loose leaf etchings. So, yeah. And yeah, there've been other things as well where I've used my own text, but normally it's somebody else's.
You were mentioning early on at the beginning of the talk this sort of mix of senses. Do you think that you might have synesthesia?
Oh yeah. I hope so. No, I think so.
To some extent, yeah. Everyone. Do you feel it's something that that there is a mixing that happens quite common with people?
Well,
experience it.
I think you can. You sense it when you go out on a spring morning and it's morning here, and somebody's just mown the grass, and yeah, it's you can almost smell the color of the grass. Some colors have a particular. I mean, anyone making perfume will tell you that there are different colors to different aromas. So that's one example.
We have a question here about, can you elaborate a bit on the dialogue you had with Robert Bringhurst in the creation of his book of poetry?
Yes, I was going to insert a bit about that. And in fact, there was very little dialogue in direct terms. I approached him well, what happened was he gave a talk to the first Codex fair, which I was also at. And so in the symposium, he gave a talk about Minucius's type. And it was such a poetic experience, as I thought, I would absolutely love to do a book with this man. And sometime or other afterwards, I summoned up the courage to write him a fan mail and asked him if he would like to work with me. And the prerequisite was it should be something that wasn't published. And I knew this was, that's why I said chutzpah before. So he said yes. But what he did was sent me the poem, and then he sat back and waited for the result. He didn't actually intervene. So I was in a bit of trepidation too about what this great typographer would say about the result. And in fact, he was very kind and actually liked it. So that was all right.
Now, the piece that you worked on during lockdown, using the ornaments, the furniture to reproduce these machines in the Museum of Work. That departure, you'd mentioned that you're sort of incorporating it a bit in your work now that's coming up. What was it like working in that form? It seems like it's quite a different approach to what you've done before. What got you thinking about even going in that direction?
Well, as I said in the talk, it was I was originally planning to do everything in woodcut, and it simply didn't work out. It was just an inappropriate medium, and so I thought, try everything once, and well, I've been working with type for quite a long time, so I knew more or less what to do about putting pieces together. But of course, everything is a bit of an experiment and an exploration and an adventure. So who knows where that will take me? I mean, it's not going to be featuring like that in the next work. I'm not going to be doing images made in metal type. Mm-hmm. I'm just doing lines of type of words, but it's at the same time it's not. It's not impossible that I'll do something else in this form. So who knows?
What were your trials in woodcut?
Oh, well, I discarded most of them. I made the frame. I did a framework. What you see made in brass rules. The whole of the framework is made in brass rules, and that I did first of all in woodcut, and yeah, I mean it wasn't precise enough. That was the problem. And I tried doing the etching press in a woodcut form, and well, yeah, I mean it would have been possible, but it would not have looked right, I think.
Yeah. The question here of do you sign and edition your books? If so, of your publications, what is the largest edition? Also, have you been tempted to reprint an edition?
The first thing, yes, I always sign my editions, and the largest ever was 150, okay. 160, but that was too large. I've still got quite a few of those. So normally the little series that you saw, the Sabioneta and the Fire and Mosebach, those were all 120, and the little one and the one I've just done with the Museum of Work, that's also 120. That seems to be quite a good number, and that's the largest edition I do.
Okay. And
yes, everything is signed. And the second question, I don't think I would have the time to do a second edition of any of them. It may happen, but it's not happening at the moment.
Yeah. Was there a particular aspect to Ulysses that you wanted to capture in your art?
Sorry?
Was there a particular aspect to Ulysses that you wanted to capture in your art? This is one of the questions that's coming in from the chat regarding your the piece you did on Joyce.
On Joyce, okay. Yes, well, it was the correspondence with the present day Hamburg. It was a sort of tour of Hamburg. So just as Joyce's Leopold Bloom goes round Dublin, I made him his alter ego in Hamburg travel around Hamburg. So it was a sort of visual tour of Hamburg, but it had to be well logistically possible. So he gets he gets into the subway. He travels to the main cemetery. To there's a burial that happens in the middle of the Ulysses. So he has to go there, and then he Hamburg, like Dublin, is a press city. So there are several newspapers published there, and his next move is to visit one of the press houses. So so he's traveling all round, and ends up in on the Reeperbahn. So you know, everything is everything's taken in, if you like, and at the same time I'm corresponding with the Odyssey. So you have 3 different time levels. That was my idea.
You were mentioning the program the Museum of Work is doing, or there's this sort of apprenticeship or the vault
Yeah.
with the two students. What are some other ideas that are floating around with the Museum of Work about engaging the next generation?
Well, another thing that happens regularly is that school classes are invited, or they book slots where a class can learn to typeset and print simple things. So in the course of 2 hours or 1.5 hours. And so a lot of these people will, from the age of about 11 to 18, they get a sort of glimpse of what's possible, and some of them can come back. And we have one of the things that we have every week is an open workshop on Monday evenings, and people can come in and learn to typeset and learn to print in that period. So there are the volunteers there on hand to help them. So it's all very much a matter of communicating the Black art to younger people.
Is your thought to, when starting out a class with a group of innocents, people who have not yet tried printing, how do you like to get people engaged with the process? What are some of the first things that you touch on with them?
Well, one of the first things to do, of course, is to get them used to the idea that everything is a mirror image, because most people are not aware that when they mix up D's and B's, for instance. So that's one of the things that that's the practical thing that they have to get used to. But also, well, you have to give them the idea also that they're part of history, and tell them a bit about Gutenberg. 500 years of printing history is, yeah, more or less history since about 1980, and so it's rediscovering this whole culture of printing, and that's you know, you give them a small amount of history at the beginning, and then you just have to, if you only have 1.5 hours, you have to get in straight away and into the practical stuff.
You've been engaging with the Museum of Work for basically the whole period that, you know, smartphones have kind of come in, the advent of smartphones have introduced. Have you felt in that time, you know, a generational shift in terms of the relation to books, like on the front lines of people talking about like the history of books and things? Has that schism really kind of shown itself?
Well, yes, that's why I mentioned at the end the need to get hold of real books, and yeah.
So it's quite acute.
Sorry.
So it's quite apparent, this kind of divide, this separation that's happening.
Yes, I think well, it's not at all corresponding to how bright or whatever you might be, because even, I mean, I know a couple of young people who have academic parents, and they are much more interested in natural sciences, and so they will not be so inclined to read books, and I feel that's a bit of a shame, but maybe they'll come back to it.
Yeah, we have another question here. Your illustrations for Ulysses dovetail beautifully with the theme of the Museum of Work, integrating changes in work and living during the last 150 years. Was this intentional, for a natural open dialogue with the generations?
Well, Ulysses and the Museum of Work are two different things.
Yeah, no, I think that this comment relates to how they kind of complement one another, or your work with that museum and Ulysses, you know, just the topics that are touched on in Ulysses.
Yeah, I think, well, every single book relates to our present life, and so I think it's going to be you can't really compare the two in the sense that that they're relating to one another, because and I don't make a book thinking, how is this going to relate to Ulysses or to Stopping By or whatever. Right. Every book stands on its own in that sense.
As much as you can talk about the projects that you're working on right now, what are your thoughts towards it? What's to come?
I'm doing one thing about Goethe's poem Ilmenau, and this is a poem that he writes as a present for the Duke Karl August, but it's relating to the silver mine in Ilmenau, which he was more or less responsible for resuscitating or reviving in the 1780s, and it didn't work. But at the time, it was a sign of hope that the town of Ilmenau, which had suffered greatly, was going to be sort of revived, and it was part of my current project on mining and in fact coal mining. I've got the other book, which is called The King is Dead, is about the coal mining industry, mostly in Germany, but also in England. And in Germany, mineral coal actually finished in 2018, and so it's going to be a timeline from antiquity to the present day, talking about that, because one of the things that I think, I mean, it's part of the extraction idea, but one of the things that we tend to forget is the people and the societies that were dependent on this industry for over a century, 1.5 centuries here and 2 centuries in Britain, and also the language, the culture, the whole way of thinking that went along with it. And so I think that that's also, I mean, it's easy to think of coal in one-dimensional terms, evil, and we must get rid of it. But we shouldn't forget the people who were involved. So that was my thought behind this new book that's happening.
Well, we really look forward to seeing that, and thank you again for putting together this presentation and the conversation. This was great, really fantastic.
Well, I've enjoyed it. Thank you.
Yeah. We will be the Alcuin Society will be doing a talk in 2 weeks, and that will be on May 26th at 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern, and it'll be George A. Walker. Registration set up for that right now. But for now, thank you again very much for taking the time, Caroline. And this will be uploaded onto the site and available for people to rewatch, and along with the video, which was tremendously informative of your work and also the processes as well that are required. So thank you so much for both.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for joining in this evening. Have a good night and have a good day.
Thank you. Thanks.